Welcome to Iraqi Dinar News, where you receive real and authentic updates about the Iraqi dinar. If you want to stay informed with moment-by-moment developments, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Today's update takes a careful and grounded look at recent political and financial developments coming out of Baghdad, and more importantly, what those developments could realistically mean for the Iraqi dinar going forward. The latest headline centers on Parliament extending its term by 30 days, a move that, while technically significant, comes as no surprise to seasoned observers of Iraq's political cycle. Delays in government formation and legislative timelines have been a recurring pattern since 2005, and this extension fits squarely within that historical context. To understand the implications, we need to separate what is routine from what is consequential. The extension itself is routine. Iraq's political system, particularly in post-election periods, has consistently struggled to meet constitutional deadlines. As noted, the 2018 government formation process stretched roughly 8 months before key ministries were filled, while the 2022 cycle extended beyond a year before a functioning government was fully established. These delays are not anomalies. They are part of the structural reality of coalition politics in Iraq, where competing blocs must negotiate power-sharing agreements across sectarian and political lines. However, the more important issue is not the extension itself, but the environment into which Parliament has extended its mandate. The reference to the room Parliament walked back into is the one that matters, points directly to the current fiscal and monetary constraints facing the country. At the center of this situation is the 2026 federal budget, which, according to the report, is effectively closed. That phrasing suggests limited flexibility for new spending initiatives or financial maneuvering without additional legislative action. This brings us to Article 24, a critical legal constraint that is now shaping Iraq's financial options. Article 24 blocks new borrowing unless a seated and fully functional parliament passes a specific law authorizing it. In practical terms, this means that without legislative clarity and cohesion, Iraq cannot easily access external or internal borrowing mechanisms to cover fiscal gaps. This limitation becomes particularly important when government revenues are under pressure or when liquidity needs increase. Another key element mentioned is the halt of oil proceeds cash flows through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This is a significant point that deserves careful explanation. Iraq's oil revenues, which make up the vast majority of government income, are typically processed through international financial channels, including accounts linked to the Federal Reserve System. Any disruption or halt in these flows can create immediate liquidity constraints, even if oil production itself remains stable. When oil revenue inflows are interrupted or delayed, the government's ability to meet domestic obligations, such as salaries, subsidies, and operational expenses, can be strained. This does not necessarily mean the country is insolvent, but it does create short-term cash flow challenges that require careful management by both the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of Iraq. The mention of reserve stress signaled on Iraqi state television adds another layer to the situation. Foreign currency reserves are a cornerstone of monetary stability, especially for a country like Iraq that relies heavily on oil exports and imports a large portion of its consumer goods. These reserves are used to stabilize the exchange rate, support imports, and maintain confidence in the financial system. When there are signals, whether explicit or implicit, that reserves are under stress, markets and observers tend to pay close attention. It does not automatically indicate a crisis, but it suggests that policymakers are operating within tighter constraints than before. Reserve management becomes more sensitive, and decisions around currency policy take on greater importance. This leads us to the central analytical point raised in the news paragraph. The central bank of Iraq appears to be left with two primary levers under current conditions. The first is to draw down reserves, and the second is to reprice the dinar. Let's examine both options carefully, starting with reserve drawdowns. Using reserves to manage short-term liquidity issues is a standard practice in many countries. It allows the central bank to maintain exchange rate stability and meet foreign currency demand without immediately resorting to structural changes. However, sustained or aggressive use of reserves can weaken long-term financial stability if not matched by incoming revenue or corrective policy measures. In Iraq's case, reserves have historically been a key buffer against volatility. Drawing them down provides temporary relief, but does not solve underlying fiscal or structural challenges. Therefore, if this lever is being used, it is likely intended as a short-term stabilizing measure rather than a long-term solution. The second lever, repricing the dinar, is where much of the speculation typically arises among currency watchers. However, it is essential to approach this topic with realism and discipline. Repricing a national currency, whether through revaluation or adjustment of the official exchange rate, is a complex decision that involves multiple factors, including inflation, trade balance, fiscal policy, and overall economic stability. The statement that one of those got a signal this week, the other did not, suggests that there may have been some indication related to reserve usage, while no clear evidence has emerged pointing toward an imminent currency revaluation. This distinction is critical. Signals in financial systems can be subtle, but they must be interpreted within the broader context of policy behavior and economic fundamentals. For Iraqi dinar followers, this means resisting the temptation to jump to conclusions based on partial information. While currency adjustments are always a theoretical possibility in any economy, they are rarely sudden or disconnected from broader policy frameworks. In Iraq's case, any meaningful change in the exchange rate would likely be accompanied by clear policy communication, coordination with international institutions, and supporting economic reforms. In the short term, the most likely scenario, based on the information provided, is continued reliance on reserve management and incremental policy adjustments rather than dramatic shifts. The extension of Parliament's term may provide additional time for political negotiations, but it does not immediately resolve the legal and fiscal constraints currently in place. From a market perspective, stability is often prioritized over abrupt changes, especially in environments where political uncertainty is already elevated. The Central Bank of Iraq has historically demonstrated a preference for gradual and controlled policy moves, particularly when it comes to exchange rate management. Looking at the broader economic implications, the current situation highlights the interconnected nature of Iraq's political and financial systems. Delays in parliamentary processes can have direct consequences for fiscal policy, which in turn affects monetary policy and ultimately the value of the currency. This chain reaction underscores the importance of institutional coordination and timely decision-making. In the medium term, much will depend on how quickly Parliament can move from extension to action. Passing necessary legislation, clarifying budgetary frameworks, and restoring confidence in financial flows will be key steps. The ability to unlock borrowing mechanisms or stabilize revenue channels could ease pressure on reserves and reduce the need for more drastic measures. In the long term, Iraq's economic trajectory will continue to be shaped by structural factors such as oil dependency, diversification efforts, governance reforms, and integration into the global financial system. Currency stability is ultimately a reflection of these deeper fundamentals rather than isolated policy decisions. For viewers and followers of the Iraqi dinar, the takeaway is to focus on credible indicators rather than speculation. Monitor official statements from the Central Bank of Iraq, observe trends in foreign reserves, and pay attention to legislative developments in Parliament. These are the signals that provide meaningful insight into the direction of policy. It is also important to maintain a balanced perspective. While challenges such as reserve stress and fiscal constraints are real, they are not uncommon in resource-dependent economies. What matters is how policymakers respond and whether they can navigate these challenges without undermining long-term stability. At this stage, there is no confirmed evidence pointing to an immediate or dramatic revaluation of the Iraqi dinar. The situation appears to be one of cautious management rather than abrupt transformation. That does not mean change is impossible, but it does mean that any change is likely to be measured, deliberate, and aligned with broader economic conditions. As always, responsible analysis requires separating a fact from interpretation and avoiding conclusions that go beyond the available evidence. The current developments in Baghdad provide important context, but they do not, on their own, define the future path of the dinar. We will continue to monitor these developments closely and provide updates based on verified information and sound economic analysis. If you want to stay informed with responsible and factual Iraqi dinar updates, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And as always, this content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice.